Yeah.
Leave it alone. I mean, I know there's a bill that's been passed in the Senate, and now Congress has to pick it up, so please.
It's just that, it's a no-brainer.
It is.
I mean, why change it?
And, they say, well, the farmers, they need the light in the morning. I'm like, the farmers don't either. They're out there anyway.
They're out there anyway, in the dead of winter.
Same thing with the cattlemen. They're out there in the, yeah.
Yep. We had a couple here, Mr. and Miss Cox. They had a dairy of sorts. They probably had a half a dozen cows. We got milk from them twice a week. And Mr. Cox, he fussed every time it changed. And he said, and I think the cruises are this way. They don't change their clocks. They stay because he said, my cows don't know the time has changed.
They don't.
Yeah,
They
exactly.
absolutely don't. I mean, I understand why we did it back in World War II. I understand totally. And why was it Johnson who put it back in? I mean, they took it off.
Oh, did they really? I didn't know that.
And then I think it was Johnson put it back on. I don't know why. Probably the lobbyists.
Yeah.
It's not political.
Yeah.
And it's just not been. I hate it. I just hate it.
Well, it's like, a lot of times you'll see the joke about, the Indian saying that only the white man would cut off one end of the blanket and sew it on the other end to make it longer. Yeah. So, anyway, all right. Now then, moving right along. Picking up this week with Micah. As I've been studying over these past couple of weeks while we were on spring break, I really wished we'd had the break when we were doing Isaiah. So we'd had 2 weeks to study on Isaiah. That would have been really nice. But, or actually to study on all of it, that would have been really nice. But, so I've had a little extra time to read it, at leisure before I actually begin the in-depth studying. Like last week, or of course the week before last, right after we finished up Isaiah, I didn't set into studying right away like I normally do every week. I read some other things. I picked up this little book on prayer that I've been reading during Lent and was reading some on that. And then I was reading Micah more at my leisure than I was actually studying it. But then starting back in around Wednesday last week, I've been gone back to my regular schedule of studying. But as I've been studying Micah, I've also been listening to videos, I put videos on while I'm working in the house or if I'm doing different things. And one I've mentioned him before, Andy Woods, is a pastor out of Sugar Land, Texas. And I really, really love his videos because he is such a great teacher. I almost can't put them on while I'm working because I want to stop and take notes. I want to write this down. I want to write that down. And I make notes a lot of times in my Bible, of where, at a particular book, which video I saw something in, so I can, if we go back to teach that, I can refer to that video and know exactly where it's at and not have to search for it again. But in listening to him, I heard him share a story that I thought fit really well for this study. And I've heard him tell this before, so I'm not sure which video it was on, but he was telling about the days that he played basketball. Come in. I was just getting ready to tell a story, so I'll start at the beginning. Yeah, have I told you about watching Andy Woods? Have I shared his Sugar Land, Texas? Anyway, he's a pastor in Sugar Land, Texas, and I was listening to one of his videos this week, and he shared this story, and I thought it went really well with our study of the prophets. And he was talking about his basketball days. Now, if you have it, and a lot of the morning women have watched him. He's a big guy. I mean, not only heavy, but hugely tall. I mean, I might come to here on him. I mean, big old guy. And so he played, of course, high school and college basketball on scholarship. And so he said that he learned his greatest lesson about playing basketball one season when he got hurt. And he said he couldn't play, couldn't even practice, he just showed up. And the coach told him to go and sit at the very top of the stands and watch the game. Just watch him practice and watch him play. And he said that watching the game from the top of the stands gave him a view that he'd never had of the game before. He said he was used to being in the thick of things, right in it as it was happening. And he said in sitting there, he had to watch from a different vantage point. And he called it, like I said, I've heard him tell this story many times, he calls it a view from the stands. And he said that he got to see how the whole game is played, how the different parts of the game fit together. Now, we're in the midst of March Madness, and, I played basketball for a while, and I love basketball. But there's a difference in watching it as a spectator, watching the game, and watching it as you were a part of it, and so you see the intricacies of what's happening. And he said it just gave him a picture of how it all fit together, how the plays were called and how the things happened when it fit together. And when I heard him tell that, I thought of this overview that we're doing of the prophets. I mean, and what we've always done before is verse by verse study. And so I love verse by verse study. But in this overview of the prophets, we need to know the whole story. And actually, the story as a whole, the overview gives us the story as a whole. Verse by verse gives us the whole story. And the overview gives us the story as a whole. And I think that's really important. And that works not just for the individual prophets, but we need to know the Bible as a whole. I mean, it's not just a collection of stories or verses or snippets that we memorize to get us through a tough spot. Just this morning, I'll mention this later, but that verse that's in so many different places, I will never leave you nor forsake you. The Bible is so much more than just memorizing snippets. This is one story, just one complete story of God's redemption of creation. And we have this tendency to look at it in books. We've studied this book and studied that book. But it really needs to be looked at as a whole story, a whole flowing of the story. So, anyway, as you've read Micah this past week, what were your thoughts? I mean, what struck you? What questions? What did you learn about God? Just anything you want to share about your study of Micah this week.
I thought I was studying Isaiah again.
Yeah.
Does it sound, so similar
to
what he wrote. So.
Yeah, exactly. And we'll talk about it more later, but it's the same time frame. And so the same things are going on. And so, very much like Isaiah. Linda, I'm anxious. Did you notice any difference in his writing style?
He does not have as much of the literary elements, but he has some in there.
Mm-hmm.
It's not. Isaiah was just one right after another all the way through. But
Mm-hmm.
yes, he had a lot of the parallelisms.
That goes along with it being the poetry. You're going to have that.
Yes. And let's see. I think he has alliteration, and he has some imagery, and here's the opposites, like Isaiah used, like you will store up but save nothing. You will plant but not harvest.
Uh-huh.
You will press olives but not use the oil for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Crush grapes, not drink.
It's chapter 6.
Yeah.
Those opposites.
Oh, it's nice and toasty over here.
Yeah, the heater's there for Gina.
Isaiah always reminded me of Dickens.
Mm-hmm.
It's like Dickens was brilliant and poetic, but he never said, he would take 100 words to give a.
Never say with 2 words what you can say with 150.
Right, exactly. And
my mother called that going all the way around the barn to tell your story, and I've been accused of that. So yeah.
But I thought Micah was just as poetic. I loved Micah. I think he's my favorite of the prophets. And I loved chapter 7, I wondered if maybe that was after the rapture. Because some of the things that was said kind of reminded me of what it will be like after the rapture.
During the millennial reign and
Yeah. Well, no, I was thinking.
You talk about during the tribulation?
During the tribulation. Some of the things that they talk about. Well, like even in chapter 6 where it says, that you'll eat but not be satisfied, and your emptiness and hunger shall remain in you. You shall carry away goods and those you love, but fail to save them, and those you do deliver, I will give to them. I mean, there's a lot of scripture that talks about a kind of a hopelessness.
I didn't write this in the lesson, but I thought about it, but I forgot to put it in. I think there are a lot of what, I don't know the correct term for it, but what we refer to as near and far fulfillments. Yeah. There are partial fulfillments. There are things that are going to happen during their time of judgment, during their time when Assyria comes into the north or Babylon comes into the south. There are going to be those times, especially when we get to Lamentations, and we see it's just like living in the tribulation. And also in AD 70 when Rome had destroyed Jerusalem. And I keep meaning to look up the second date. There's a second date, a second rebellion. And it's not one, I used to say it was 140 AD, like 70 and then twice that, 140, but it's not 140, it's somewhere in the 130s. But where the Temple Mount was actually plowed under. Hadrian was the Caesar.
I remember reading about that.
And it was just, he made it illegal for Jews to be in that land that he named Palestine. That's where the name Palestine came from. Hadrian named it that after the Philistines, and it forbid Jews to actually live there. So there are those periods of time that this happens in the near, but there are still elements of it that doesn't quite get fulfilled that will be completely fulfilled in the tribulation.
But wouldn't it have to be a near and far? Because one of the tests of a prophet is if what they prophesy comes true.
Well, that doesn't have to work. My understanding, that doesn't have to work for every prophecy. There has to be prophecies that they give that are completely fulfilled to make authentic prophets. But they can give other prophecies that they never see for even near and far. Well, even at that, if we say these were near and far, these things that happened, they didn't live through them. They took place, more than 100 years later. They were near the way we look at it, but it wasn't near to them. Yeah. Exactly. So yeah, I think the complete fulfillment of a lot of it is still yet to be fulfilled, but there certainly are parts of it that are fulfilled within different eras. Yeah. What else?
Israel need to get them some new scales.
Yeah. I thought of shrinkflation.
Shrinkflation, yeah.
The pack, you and I, the package is smaller, but it's the same price. Yeah. Yeah, or more. Yeah. Exactly.
More air in the bag.
Don't get me started on potato chips.
Well, it's the air that keeps them fresh.
Oh yeah, but it didn't need that much air. So.
I heard a potato chips salesman talking about helping ties.
All right, what else?
You could almost hear the plaintive cry of God. You could just hear God's heart, grieving in some places. Where He says, "Oh my people, what have I done to you?" Yeah. What have I done? Look what I did for you. I did this for you. Justify your rebellion.
Yeah. And I think Pastor Pat's been talking about Palm Sunday upcoming, and we always think of Palm Sunday in particular. Of course, we know Holy Week and what goes on then, but we always think of Palm Sunday and Easter as being joyous times, and they are joyous times. But Palm Sunday was not joyous for Jesus. I mean, he cried as he went into Jerusalem. Mark and Matthew and Luke both. I'm not sure if Mark does, John doesn't, but Matthew and Luke both speak of him crying. Luke, as he's going in, crying. And oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, and it's just this.
I would have drawn you to myself.
Like a hen draws her chicks, but you would not. I love that from the King James version of that, with the flow of it. But yeah, and just the things that God is saying here, that Micah is relating from God. Yeah, that same kind of pain, that same kind of anguish, knowing that you imagine Jesus coming in, knowing that they're going to reject him, knowing full well what's going to take place at the end of the week and how they will completely reject him. I mean, that's I always think about that with Palm Sunday. Well, what else on Micah? Anything else?
The different cities that were listed.
Yeah.
In the first chapter, in this commentary in this Bible, it talks about the wordplay that the city, the Hebrew word means, and then what you say is going to happen is just the opposite of what that city's name means.
Yeah. A play on those words, exactly. Yeah, I want to share those because it was really interesting when I was studying that. And again today, I found some more information on it, made it a little bit clearer. But it's interesting in the commentaries. Some of them mentioned that. Some of them spoke entirely of the, I guess you'd say the current day situation, had nothing to do with the names. And I just see that what he's done with the names there is part of his personality. The way he, the cry beginning in verse 8 there, his grief and his crying, and then as he goes into that, this way that he describes those cities, that's a part of who he is and the way he does things. So yeah, we'll spend some time on that.
So will he turn and walk around naked, or is that
Yes,
that
a
was
spiritual
what I was gonna
reference
ask
to
you.
be
Did he walk around naked?
Well, I don't know. He says, because of this, I must lament and wail. I must go barefoot and naked.
Yeah.
I don't know if in fact, the commentaries I was reading said, if, one in particular, I don't remember which one it was, but he said, if he did this literally, he was not the only one to do it, because Ezekiel did it as well. So I don't know, but maybe maybe his idea of naked is not completely without clothes, because when I think of Ezekiel, I think it's wintertime over there. Ezekiel did it for 2 years. We don't know how long he did this, but if it means completely without clothing, or if it means, the bare minimum, or in his underwear, I don't know. Oh, if he did or not.
Could it be a spiritual connotation that this is, I'm laying it out here, this is
Could very well be. I really, in his case, now Ezekiel I think probably did, knowing some of the things Ezekiel did. But in Micah's case, I really do lean more toward it being a picture of, I am just laying it all out here. Because of the rest of what that says, I must lament like the jackals and a mourning like the ostriches. In fact, I saw one commentary today. If you've ever heard of an ostrich make their sound, this one commentary I was looking at, I think they were in the San Diego Zoo. He said they heard this sound, and he said it was the most heart-rending, pitiful sound you could imagine. He asked one of the employees, "What is that?" And they said, "It's the ostriches." I didn't even know what kind of a sound an ostrich made. I don't know, but
Poor ostriches are just so unfortunate. It looked like they were made out of spare parts.
yeah, they do. But I could eat ostrich. They say they taste very beefy. So,
Yeah, they were to
Oh,
Jasper
they taste like
Jones.
chicken.
That'd be Jasper Jones.
Jasper Jones.
Well, what's that? I missed that.
What, she's spare parts,
Yeah.
I thought of Jasper Jones.
Oh, yeah.
That'd be a Jasper.
Or Johnny Cash, I stole it one part at a time. Y'all probably don't know that song, so.
Oh, I do.
All right, what else about Micah, about reading it?
Well, Micah, every time we all think about Micah, we all think about the verses. Is what does the Lord require of you to
Yeah.
do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly? Well, my Amplified Bible said, do justice, love mercy, and kindness.
Yeah.
And walk humbly with, seek humility and walk with a humble heart.
Mm-hmm.
Which was, I thought, kind of I've never heard it
Yeah.
said, love mercy and kindness.
Uh-huh. Yeah, it's the expansion on the words are so much more there, and it's been, that verse has been called the Old Testament version of the Golden Rule.
Yeah.
But again, I mean, we talk about context. Again, when we look at it in its context and see what it follows after, then we understand the statement that much more. It's important as it stands, and it will stand alone. But to know what God really wants in response to what the people have been asking gives it much more,
Wait.
much more weight as well. So,
Just the judgment and the hope and the remnant.
yeah.
Oh, yeah. I love
Judgment
everything about
and
the
hope
remnant.
and remnant. This repeating of that over, and all the prophets do that. All the prophets. I had this whole thing that I had got the idea from one of the commentaries just in talking about prophets as a whole, and I ended up not even using any of that, but I've got it in my notes if I ever want to use it at another time. But it says, it's right here. The prophet is a man at odds with his time. The prophets are some of the most disturbing people who ever lived. This is true not only because of what they said, but because of what they were. Just how they lived, how God's word came to them, and they had, every one of them saw the sin. Every one of them saw the needed and the coming judgment. But every one of them also saw the hope. Now, some obviously spend more time on the hope and more detail than others, but they all have that element of hope there. I hate to use a blanket statement because we've not finished them yet. It may end up with one that does. But to my understanding, or to what I know about them so far, none of them just leave you hanging with no hope whatsoever.
And I like the very end when he makes a list of what God is like, who and what he does. He pardons sins, he forgives trespasses, he shows mercy, he has compassion, and treads our sins underfoot, and he will hurl all their iniquities into the depths of the sea.
I mean, isn't that a picture?
Who is like God?
Who is like God? Well, that's Micah's name, but he also uses that phrase.
Yeah.
And if you that's that picture, he doesn't just toss it into, he hurls it into the sea. Yeah. Cast, New American Standard says, will cast all their sins into the depth of the sea. And you got to understand that for the Israelite, the sea was a forbidden place. Nothing came back from the sea, and so that just adds that much more to it.
I never heard that. Nothing came back from the sea.
That's why the Great White Throne Judgment, when it talks about the sea will give up its dead, because they had such a huge fear of the sea. They were not seagoing people. Now, Sea of Galilee, I mean, that's different, like a lake, but sea, like the Mediterranean Sea, they had a fear of the sea, which says a lot about Jonah, that he overcame that fear to leave. Anything else? It's good. It's good. I'm really enjoying this time of this, and it's in all three groups. We're having this much response, and about what you've read and what's touched you about the different prophets and the different parts. So, and as we go along, if you think of something else, please stop me or say it, and so we can share that, because what I'm going to do, as I've done in all of them, we'll talk about the introduction to the book of the Micah the man and the time frame, the era, and all that, and then we'll look at the message of the book. But as we do that, anything else that you think of, please feel free to share that. Is that it? For now? For now. All right. Well, so as we begin, like we've been doing, as I said, we'll talk about Micah the man. And honestly, we know very little about it. I mean, we know less about him probably than we do any of the others. We don't even know his father's name. At least with some of the others, we knew their father's name. There are a few other men in the Old Testament named Micah or Micaiah, which is like Will and William. It's, a shortening of the name. There are a few of those in Scripture, but none of them actually fit the time frame to be this Micah. We know, as we said a moment ago, his name means who is like Yahweh, or who is like the Lord. So apparently he was born into a godly home. Kay Arthur said this about Micah. She said, Micah knew his calling and was ready to fulfill it, for Micah knew his God. And I thought, wow, what a wonderful way to be described. Micah knew his God. We know from verse 1 that he was from Moresheth, or some of your maps may say Meresheth, and I hope you're pulling out your maps as you're reading. But verse 14 gets a little bit more specific, and he says Moresheth Gath. It's like we would say, not only are you from Knoxville, you're from East Knoxville. It narrows it down a little bit more. But on the map, we see that Moresheth is located about 25 miles southwest, I wrote east here, but it's southwest of Jerusalem. So that puts it in the outlying areas. Everybody see where that's at? We have Marishah.
Yeah, it's black and white.
It's actually on both of them.
Yeah.
It's called Marishah on both of them, Maresha. But on the black and white one, it's a little easier to see. We actually have Marishah Gath on the black and white one there. But it's just like it's an outlying area of Gath, or between Marishah and Gath itself. But that puts it on the color one. If you have that handy, we see where it says Philistia, and in the purple there is the southern kingdom of Judah, and then that white area there is Philistia, where the Philistines live. And we see that it's really just Gath is in Philistia, and in Marishah it's just a little ways in, so it's just right on the edge of Philistia. And that's important, because being near that border of Philistia, he is in, we might call it the outskirts of Judah. He's really closer to Philistia than he is to Jerusalem, further away. And so we'll talk about it a little bit more later, but when Assyria came down after they had attacked Israel and they came on down into Judah, it was these outlying cities, these smaller areas, that Assyria attacked and really did a lot of damage to them, and then required tribute, or taxes we can call it, tribute from them. But this was also another thing about this. It's a little hard to see. I don't have a really good topographical map, but you can kind of tell where the mountain range is on the colored map. But that puts it in the plains area, the flatter land, which means good farmland. And so Micah has been referred to, and in fact more than one commentary, I didn't write down which commentary because it was in several of them, but more than one commentary referred to Micah as a country preacher. And that's why I was wondering, Linda, about his the way that he wrote. Would it?
One to say, you wouldn't think that he was as educated as Isaiah was, but
He still was pretty articulate.
Very, very articulate. Just because you're country don't mean you're not educated.
By gosh darn no.
Oh heck, we'll talk about that more in a minute. But like Amos, he was a lot like Amos. He was, Amos was Tekoa, which is over closer to Bethlehem there. But Amos, we said that he was almost even like a migrant farm worker, because not only did he a keeper of the flocks, but he was also a tender of the sycamores. And the way the sycamore grew, it didn't grow where they would have flocks, so that meant he had to travel. So kind of like a migrant farm worker. He went wherever the work was. So in that respect, Micah was a lot like Amos. He was not from the city. He wasn't involved in what we would say in city politics. In fact, I think we can actually see a healthy distrust of the big city leaders in his writing. But that didn't mean he lived in a vacuum either. Amos was given a burden. We called him the burden bearer. That's what his name means. He was given a burden for Israel, and he went to Israel from Tekoa, made a trip from Tekoa all the way up to Samaria and up to Bethel in Israel. But Micah, although Micah spoke where he was well aware of what was happening, not only in his own surrounding area, but he was aware of what was happening in Israel. Now, how was he? How did that happen? We don't know. We don't know unless it was the merchants that traveled, that are going to be going through and bringing news. That's how most of the news traveled in those days. It's quite possible that as a very young man, way before his call, he may have known Amos. Amos may have come back and shared with him. I think of Paul on his first missionary journey. We don't learn this until later, but on his first missionary journey is when he met Timothy as a very young boy. You think of the influence that Paul had on this kid, Timothy. And then when he goes on his second missionary journey, Timothy becomes part of his missionary group. But it was that first meeting when Timothy was very, very young. And it could well be, this is just conjecture, but it could well be that Amos, when he came back, that Micah knew him and heard these stories, and that just developed his desire and his passion for them, and then he kept up with it in whatever way that he could as time went by. And God gave him a message for both Judah and Israel. Of course, Israel will go into captivity during the time of Micah's ministry, but and from that time on, he turns his focus to Judah. But up until then, he's speaking to both of them. He's calling for repentance in both parts. One commentary said Micah had a keen social conscience. Some think he showed a greater awareness of social evils than Amos did. And I noticed a lot of the commentaries compared Micah to Amos. But as I was reading it, I don't remember reading this in any of the commentaries, but as I was reading Micah and knowing what we already know about Amos and about Hosea, I really see more of Hosea in him. I see he doesn't have that personal tragedy like Hosea, marrying the harlot, but something happened that touched him personally. Perhaps he talks about, the things that we've mentioned already, the things that he talks about that were done to people, maybe they were done to him or someone he loved. For instance, in chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, when he says, "Woe to those who scheme iniquity, who work out evil on their beds," and they think about it all night. When morning comes and they do it, for it's in their power, the power of their hands. They see a field they want, they take it. They see a house, they take it. He may have seen a relative lose a house like that. On down in verse 9, the women of my, God is speaking here, but of course Micah is relating this. The women of my people you evict, each one from her pleasant house, meaning a house filled with pleasantries, a house filled with memories. She's been evicted from that. From her children you take my splendor forever. Maybe Micah had seen that. Or in chapter 3, verses 1 through 4, where he goes into this detail of how the rulers of the house of Israel, and at that time he's speaking of Israel as a whole, but the things that he did, and he uses, I don't think this is speaking literally, I think it is speaking figuratively, when it says you tear off their skin from them, the flesh from their bones, they eat the flesh of my people, they strip off their bones, chop them up like meat in a kettle. I don't think that's literal, but I think it is, you've taken everything from them they have. He may have known those people. He may have felt that personal connection, that personal experience, being that far away because that's how they were being treated. I said on your lesson sheet that Warren Wiersbe described the era this way. He said society in Judah was rapidly changing from rural to urban in defiance of the law of Moses. And remember, the law of Moses was that every seven years was a Sabbath year, but every 50 years, year of Jubilee, everybody got their property back. But in defiance of that, wealthy investors were buying up small family farms. Oh, goes to today. And developing huge land holdings, which created serious problems for the poor. I mean, there's nothing new that's happening today that hadn't already happened in that very same way. Now, Micah does speak out against idolatry. Isaiah, really, a lot of Isaiah was on the idolatry. Shaping the graven images and the idols and, all the stuff he went into. But Micah does speak against that. But Micah focuses in on the way people were treated. Just like Amos and Hosea did. But I don't know about you, but I just felt that he felt it. It just felt like he was speaking from experience.
If he was that migrant farmer, whatever, country preacher, and going
Yeah.
to place, he would have seen that. He would have seen more on hand.
Yeah.
He wasn't in the political realm. He wasn't in the religious realm, part of the temple or priest or anything of that nature.
The establishment.
So he's looking at it from a people perspective,
Right.
which is very personal.
Right. I've been reading some books, actually one book in particular, a man by the name of Benjamin Roth. It's called The Depression, a Diary. And it's this man, he lived in Youngstown, Ohio, and began keeping a diary. He was a lawyer, began keeping a diary just before the crash in 1929. He actually kept the diary all the way, I think he lived up to the 60s. He actually kept the diary that long. But the book, it goes from like 1929 to, it goes through 41, the war and when Japan attacked. But just to read that and what was going on in people's lives. And I really, I don't want to say enjoyed the book. It was a fascinating book, but I would really love to read one. Of course, he was a downtown, he lived in town in the urban area. He was a lawyer. I would love to read the same type of thing from someone who lived in the country.
Sometime I can tell you, I've got a lot of stories that my dad passed on.
Yeah.
Because he lived in Blackshear, Georgia, and which is, a speck.
Yeah.
And my grandfather was an engineer on the railroad, but he also had a huge farm. And Daddy would tell me stories that he heard from his father about what happened during the Depression.
Yeah. I've wished 1,000 times I'd asked Mother more about it, but
he said
you just don't think.
A man would show up, always at the back door. A man would show up with his family, with his children, and want to know if he could work, for a day. They never asked for a handout. They would always say, "Do you have any work for me?"
Yeah.
And Granddaddy would always say yes, but let's give you something to eat first. And they would always serve him on the back porch. And sometimes they'd sleep for 2 or 3 days.
Yeah.
A man and his family on the back porch. you know, and because they had a huge big screen porch with beds and stuff. I mean, he's got tons of stories. I should write those down.
Yeah, you really should write those down, because that is so important to know. You know, and what Micah, like Amy said, what Micah is writing about, going as a country preacher, having these connections with the people, whether it happened to him, like we said, we don't know what happened to Jonah. We don't know what made him act the way he did toward the Ninevites. But, you know, there's something happened. And something happened with Micah in the same way, whether it was to him personally or people he was related to or just people that he knew that he saw that. From verse 1, we can see the time frame in which he ministered. It was from the days of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, who were kings in Judah. He doesn't mention the kings of the northern kingdom, but as we said, this puts him in the same time frame as the prophet Hosea, who was prophesying at that time in the north, and Isaiah in the south. Hosea and Isaiah both mention King Uzziah as the first king in their call, which tells us that Micah came on the scene just a little bit later. You know, perhaps he was younger, and maybe it was the words of Hosea and Isaiah that spoke to him, that allowed him to hear God's call to him, that stirred him, and allowed him to hear God's call and understand that he was called to speak as well. We said that he prophesied during the same time as Isaiah, and you know, we talked here. It's in the commentaries about the similarities between the two. In fact, I have a note in my Bible about about Micah, and I've called it a Reader's Digest version of Isaiah. You know, as I said, you felt like you were reading Isaiah, but it's a condensed version of Isaiah. One of the commentaries called it, called it Isaiah in shorthand, which both of those date me, and the younger people wouldn't have a clue what I'm talking about, Reader's Digest, shorthand, you know. But there is an overall similarity between the two. In fact, I don't know if you noticed this, Micah chapter 4 verses 1 through 4 quotes Isaiah chapter 2 verses 3 and 4 word for word. So who's quoting whom? Or is God giving the same message to two men?
Yes.
That's what I think it is. I think it's because the message is always true. The message doesn't change. And so I believe God gave the same message to both of the men. As we talked earlier, we talked last time about how educated and sophisticated Isaiah was, how he had access to both the temple and the presence of the king. We've talked about his use of all the literary tricks. Well, you know, as I said, Micah may have just been a country boy, but that doesn't mean he was uneducated. He had a different kind of education. And as Amy said, we don't see it in our English translation. When I first started reading this last week, and I was reading that second part there of chapter 1, I just couldn't make heads or tails of these cities and what he was saying about them. I was trying to locate them. You know, has that got some importance to it? And then as I began studying it, and oh, okay, now I get you. The play on words, the puns that he uses. We don't see it in our English translation, but Micah had a masterful gift of the sardonic, which means biting sarcasm. I mean, he was good. I know a few folks like that. And we'll talk in a few minutes about what these cities are and what he's saying. But we know Micah's words were powerful, and many scholars think that even though he was a country preacher, even though Isaiah is the one who has access to the kings, that it was Micah's words that had some influence on Hezekiah's reforms. Now, I didn't take the time to really dig into why they thought Micah's words over Isaiah's, but a lot of them talked about Micah having an influence on the early reforms that Hezekiah did, just in getting these things started and going. He is even quoted by Jeremiah in Jeremiah 26 by name, quoted by name in Jeremiah 26 verses 16 through 19. But here's something that I didn't realize. Micah was the first prophet to predict the utter destruction of Jerusalem. I mean, the complete annihilation of Jerusalem. I mean, we talk about progressive revelation, and all we mean by that is that more and more is revealed as we go along. And we've seen that. Joel, as you remember, spoke of it, quote, an army that was coming. Didn't give the army a name, just an army that's coming. Amos and Hosea both spoke of Assyria coming against the northern kingdom if they didn't repent. In Isaiah, and again here in Micah, we see Assyria actually coming. That comes to fulfillment. In fact, in about 10 or 15 years of Micah's call, Assyria would totally obliterate the northern kingdom. And at that time, as you remember we saw in Isaiah, they would come to the very gates, or as Isaiah called it, to the neck of Jerusalem. And as you remember, Isaiah told Hezekiah in chapter 39 that Hezekiah's house, his sons, would be taken into captivity by Babylon. Now we know what's going to happen, but he doesn't tell him that. If we just read it, making ourselves not know the rest of the story. All Isaiah tells Hezekiah is that his sons are going to be taken into captivity. Isaiah doesn't say anything about what's going to happen in the temple, about what's going to happen to Jerusalem, anything else, just his sons. Micah, though, in chapter 1, beginning in verse 8, is, as we've said earlier, was so filled with grief as he saw evil come to the very gate of Jerusalem. But then as we go on in chapter 2, he actually uses the words completely destroyed. And in chapter 4, verse 10, he mentions Babylon specifically. Oh, but I got to throw this in, one commentary, because I want you all to know what's being said out there. One commentary actually said that Micah prophesied that Jerusalem would be completely destroyed, and when it wasn't, he may have gone off into a self-imposed retirement. Where do they get this stuff? Yeah. Anyway, that was in a bona fide, paid money for commentary. So
I wouldn't use that commentary anymore.
Well, it's not Barclay. A lot of times I'll use Barclay. I don't recommend Barclay for new Christians because of some of the things that he doesn't believe. But he's excellent when it comes to history. That's what I use him for. This particular one has some things that I can glean from it, and I know enough to put a big X on it in the commentary. So if anybody after me gets it, they know they don't pay any attention to that part. So, but anyway, again, like many of the other prophets, the critic, we've talked about what the critics are saying about the book. The critic questions whether Micah wrote the whole book or whether he even wrote the book at all. How many writers? I mean, we were up to 4 different writers for Isaiah. Well, they're saying at least 2, maybe 3 different writers for Micah. I'm like, boy, none of them said much if you got 3 different writers.
It's the same though, all the way across.
Exactly. It's the reason for that is that chapters 4 and 5, the messianic prophecies, is so different than the first part and the last part that they said somebody inserted that later. Right, okay. Just so we're on the same page here. So anyway, and he may have been surprised when he prophesied that Jerusalem would be utterly destroyed. He may have been surprised that Assyria came there. After seeing what Assyria did to the north, Assyria come right to the very gates of Jerusalem. And then, of course, we know the other side of the story. We know from Isaiah what happened. But seeing that they left and it wasn't destroyed then, he may have been surprised at that. But I believe that he believed that God said Jerusalem would be destroyed, and it would be. I believe that he likely would have said, not this time, but that will be later. It may have not happened now, but it will happen because God said it would. And around 100 years later is when it happens. So as I was thinking this morning, as I was preparing to start on this, and I was thinking about prophecy and what you and I think of as the future and what the prophets thought of as the future. And actually it's two different things. When you and I talk about the future, we mean tomorrow or next week or at the most a year or two out. But when God speaks of the future, He could be talking about tomorrow, because we know that there are days when things happen. This day it hadn't happened, and this day it has happened. I mean, there is a day when, in that day, those things are going to be fulfilled. But for the most part, more likely, God is talking about 70 to 100 years out, if not 2,000 years out or more. That's God's view of the future. But we know, that's what I really love about these three groups of women. As I said, we are on the same page. We know that if God said it, it will happen. It may not have happened yet, but it will happen. So Micah could see what had happened, what was happening to Israel, the northern kingdom, and they were on the verge of going into captivity, and then he actually saw them go into captivity. And by the way, I forget where it's at. I don't know if it's in Chronicles or in Kings both, but I know it's in 2 Kings. When that happened, when the northern kingdom went, when Assyria finally came in, they'd had enough, they came in, they destroyed everything that was there, took people into captivity. There were a huge number of people that escaped and came to the southern kingdom. So, they got the full detail. Those in the southern kingdom got the full detail of what was happening in the north. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, I started to say about Issachar. It's talked about the tribe of Issachar that could read the times. That's most often quoted in speaking about prophecy. But what it really is speaking about is they saw what was happening between David and Saul, and the whole tribe of Issachar followed David because they could see. They had discernment. They could see what happened. But a lot of these people had discernment and came south before that happened, but then a lot of them escaped when it was happening. But Micah was pleading with Judah not to make the same mistakes. You've seen what's happened to the north. Don't make those same mistakes. But the book, we've already said, like many of the prophetic books, is written in Hebrew poetic form, parallelism. There's puns and plays on words and all these different ways that he has put this together for us. The book of Micah is quoted twice in the New Testament. There's, of course, that famous one in Micah 5:2 about the birthplace of the ruler, which was quoted in Matthew 2:56 when the Magi came to Jerusalem. And there was a lesser known quote. In fact, I didn't even realize this was a quote from Micah. Jesus says in Matthew 10:35 and 36, when he's talking about a man's enemies being those of his own household, I didn't realize that was a quote from Micah. But he is quoting Micah when he says that. That's from Micah chapter 7, verse 6. Micah speaks of the Messiah in chapter 2, verse 13, when he calls him the king. In chapter 4, 1 through 8, speaking of his reign. In chapter 5, verse 2, of course, speaking of his birthplace, his lineage, and even his origin, his eternality. And in fact, all of chapter 5 speaks of what he will do. Micah was confident that someday the Lord would restore the people of Israel, calling them the whole nation. Once the northern kingdom went into captivity, in fact, we were talking about this in our Sunday school class yesterday. Our Sunday school lesson yesterday was on Zephaniah. So Joe spent several days last week reading and studying Zephaniah and getting it in his mind, where it is in history, what's going on, some of the same things that we do. But and Elaine said during Sunday school class, she said, when I hear the word Israel, I automatically think of the north. And we do. We think of the divided kingdom. But once the northern kingdom went into captivity, the name Israel returned to the entire. The south was referred to as Israel from then on. Because the northern it was wiped out. And so they're all called Israel from that point on. And so he speaks of how the Lord would restore the people of Israel, the whole nation, to a place of prominence in the world under the Anointed One. And that's why he was writing. He was writing to warn and to encourage. So that's where we are. That's the setting, that's the background, that's the writer. Any comments or questions before we get into the actual scripture of the book?
Well, he also referred to, the Bible also refers to as the tribe of Judah.
It does.
The
but
southern kingdom.
But once the northern kingdom's gone, you seldom see that. They're called Israel from then on. Think of this example.
I didn't realize that.
Huh?
I didn't realize that.
Yeah. In fact, we'll see that when we get to Jeremiah a lot more clearly. And I was trying to think of a good example for that. And so I was thinking of this. Say, you remember, or you know, we live in the United States. During the Civil War, there was the United States and the Confederate States. Once the Confederate States went away, the whole became the United States again. Same concept there. When the one went away, they're no longer a part of it in the name.
Because there wasn't a northern kingdom
Right.
after that.
It's all Israel from that point. So, anything else before we go on? All right. Well, I said on your lesson sheet, and you got to remember, when I put those lesson sheets together, I was just reading snippets in different commentaries to try to give you an overview, the time frame, some things, what you could read, things to look for. But I said on your sheet that just like Isaiah, Micah could be divided into two parts. Chapters 1 through 3 speak of judgment. Chapters 4 through 5 of restoration. I don't know what I was doing with chapters 6 and 7. I just didn't mention it at all. So that's what I messed up on. But the more I've studied it, even that's not true. So, I mean, I did get that out of the commentary, but I don't agree with that now. As I've studied it, I really began to see a better picture of it. Actually, and I don't know if you picked up on this as you were reading it, but the book can be divided into 3 messages. Did you see that? The 3 segments? Anybody see those 3 segments? Remember how we watch for repeated words?
Yeah.
We have 3 segments or 3 messages, each beginning with the word hear or listen. I think the New Living Translation says pay attention. But this word hear or listen is a Hebrew word that we're familiar with. It's the word Shema. You know, hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God, the Lord is one. We refer to that as the Shema. Well, the word hear doesn't just mean let it go in one ear and out the other. Just hear it. It means hear and obey. So that word for listen in those 3 areas or 3 sections is the word Shema. Let it sink in. Each segment or each message contains the sin, the punishment, and the hope to come. That's in all 3 of those messages. And you remember what we always say about the word hope. It doesn't mean wishful thinking. It means it's a certainty. So we can divide them up this way. And since I wrote this after 9 o'clock last night, I didn't have time to print it out for you. But message 1 is the coming judgment. That's chapter 1, verse 2 through chapter 2. The coming judgment. Chapter 1, verse 2, because of course verse 1 is just setting the stage. Chapter 1, verse 2 through chapter 2. Chapter 1, verse 2 says, "Hear, O peoples, all of you." That's how it begins. The second message is the coming ruler. And that's chapters 3 through 5. Chapter 3, verse 1 says, "And I said, hear now, heads of Jacob." The word hear again. And then the third message, the coming kingdom. And that's chapters 6 and 7. Chapter 6 begins, "Hear now, or listen, depending on what your translation has. Mine has hear, hear, hear now. Like there's, it's emphatic. It's important that if you haven't been listening before, you need to listen now. Did everybody get those? If you want to get that down?
Yeah.
So I'm just going to kind of hit the high points on this, and if you need me to repeat any of these sections, just say, slow down, or would you repeat there, or whatever. So, message 1, the coming judgment. Chapter 1, verse 2 through chapter 2. So, verse 1 of chapter 1, as we said, sets the stage. The word of the Lord which came to Micah of Moresheth in the days of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, which he saw concerning Samaria, being the northern kingdom, and Jerusalem, the southern kingdom. That sets the stage. That's what this whole book is about. And then verse 2, hear. Hear, O peoples, all of you. So who's supposed to listen? All the people. Not only all the people, but all the earth and all it contains. Why? Let the Lord God be a witness to you. The Lord where? From his holy temple. And that reminds us of Isaiah 6. Remember Isaiah saw the Lord high and lifted up? Well, in the end of verse 2 and in verse 3, the Lord is coming down, coming forth. Verse 3, for behold, the Lord is coming forth from his place. And what's he going to do? He will come down and tread on the high places of the earth. That's verses 3 and 4 is the reason to listen. They're told to listen. And they're told the reason why to listen. Because the Lord's coming. And the things that are going to happen. The mountains will melt. The valleys be split. And this literally physically has not happened yet. But we read in 2 Peter 3:10 that the earth will melt when the Lord comes in his second coming. So this is one of those prophecies that symbolically it happens when he comes in judgment, but it will also happen physically when the Lord returns. Verse 5, this is like a courtroom setting. I mean, you know how I am about my courtroom dramas. This is a courtroom setting. In verse 5, we have God's indictment. In other words, the charge is read against them. All this that's going to happen, why is he going to do it? It is for the rebellion of Jacob and the sins of the house of Israel. And then this is where the northern kingdom has not gone into captivity yet, so he divides them out. What is the rebellion of Jacob, the northern? Is it not Samaria, the capital of the north? What is the high place of Judah, the southern kingdom? Is it not Jerusalem, the capital? So the indictment is read of what's going to happen to why God is going to bring judgment, going to bring this coming judgment. Verses 6 and 7 is the sentence. The indictment has been read and the sentence will be carried out. This is what he's going to do. I'm going to make Samaria a heap of ruins in the open country. He's going to pour her stones down in the valley. All of her idols be smashed. All these earnings, that because she's followed after all these other gods and these other places, it's been like a harlot's earnings or prostitute's wages, as we saw in Hosea. So that's the sentence that's going to be carried out against them. Verses 8 and 9 is we see Micah's grief. As we talked earlier, you can just feel this pain that he's feeling because of this. I must. Now he will speak for God at times, but I believe he's speaking for himself here. Because of this, I must lament and wail. I must go barefoot and naked. I must make a lament like the jackals and a mourning like the ostriches. Why? For her, Samaria's wound is incurable. There's no turning back.
It's almost a resignation.
Yeah, it's a resignation.
He's resigned.
Yeah, he's resigned to the fact that, and we know, as I said, it will take place in about 10 to 15 years of the beginning of his ministry, but he sees it so clearly that there's no turning back at this point. And it has come to Judah. Assyria has come down, as we said, even the gate of Jerusalem. And then we come to these verses 10 through 15a. And I titled this in my notes here, Micah's Song of Bitter Sarcasm. And I'll try, I've got the notes here in my Bible. I didn't write all this out. But every one of these cities has a meaning to the town. The verse 10, tell it not in Gath, weep not at all. The word Gath, the word itself means weep town. So he's saying, in weep town, don't weep. At, however you pronounce this, Beth-leharif, whatever, that name, anytime you see Beth, or Bait, it's pronounced Bait, that is, it means house of, like Bethel, house of God. Anytime you see Bait or Beth, it means house of. So this is the house of dust. At the house of dust, go roll yourself in the dust. Pick up the slack, Jack. That's what came to my mind when I was reading that. The inhabitant of Shephar, that means beauty town. When in the beauty town, you'll be naked. The inhabitant of Zanan, that word means going out. In the town of going out, you'll go out. In the town of Beth Ezel, let's see, where did I write that one? That's the house of removal. In the house of removal, you'll be removed. I mean, you see,
Yeah.
You and I was trying to think of how would you explain this. All these city names are play on words. It would be like we would say, there is no fountain in Fountain City. There'll be no fountain left in Fountain City. There's no king in Kingsport. He's tying that to all of these places. The inhabitant of Marath, who means bitter, becomes weak. They got a bitter report. Calamities come down from the north to the gate of Jerusalem. Harness the chariot to the team of horses, O inhabitant of Lachish. The word Lachish was a military town, and they called it the horse town. Harness the chariot to the team of horses down there in Horsetown. Why? Because she was the beginning of sin, the influence, the pagan influence. In a military city where all of these military men would, come and go and bring in everything from everywhere else, the sin that was brought into there was brought in from the north. They would. What was the old thing from World War II? How you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Perry? Once they've seen these places, once they've experienced these places, they brought it back to where they were from. Because in you were found the rebellious acts of Israel. Therefore you will give parting gifts on behalf of Moresheth Gath. And this was Micah's hometown. The houses of Akzib, and the word Akzib, the word itself means a winter brook, and I thought, it said the houses of Akzib will become a deception. That's the way my translation reads. And I thought, what has a winter brook got to do with that? And the more I read, then I realized that in Israel, what was called a winter brook, or we would call it a creek, would be deceptive because it might have water and it might not. So it was the equivalent of a lie. So Lie Town will tell lies. I was just fascinated how he tied all these together. And if you read it through without going slowly and breaking each one down, if you can read it through and pick up the flow, you can just feel his heart being anguished. You can see that sarcasm that he uses in that. And in verses 15, the first continues on the first part of verse 15. I will bring you the one who takes possession, O inhabitant of possession. The possessor will take possession. The glory of Israel will enter Adullam. That's the caves. Even the best, the glory of Israel, the best that Israel has, and he's still talking about the north here. The glory that Israel has will hide in caves. They will run and hide. And we will see that in Revelation. You remember how they run and hide in caves?
This commentary here was talking about this, that David fled from Saul, starting in Gath and ending up in this last city, Adullam, if they were.
Adullam, however you pronounce it. Yeah.
That was kind of a neat cross-reference.
Yeah.
To the city.
From Gath to there. Yeah, exactly. And then verse 16 is the result of the sentence. Weeping and mourning. Anytime you see in Scripture something about being bald or cutting off your hair, or they cut off somebody's beard or whatever, that is a sign of disgrace and mourning. Make yourself bald and cut off your hair. Why? Because the children of your delight, your precious little ones, it's going to get so bad that extend your baldness like the eagle, he puts in parentheses. They, your children, even your children, will go from you into exile. I mean, just the fact that he repeats it, not only because it's poetry and parallelism repeats it, but just the way that he repeats it, you can just feel his heart. Make yourself bald and cut on your hair, because the children, just cut off all your hair, because your children will go into exile. You just can't help but feel that. And then in chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, he gives a warning. Woe to those people who scheme iniquity. And I couldn't find, I didn't take the time, I just glanced for it, but I didn't find it. Some of you may know. There is a verse somewhere in Proverbs that is very similar to this. It talks about scheming on your bed. At night you're thinking up the schemes, and the next day you carry them out. And so that's what he's saying. Woe to those who spend their night scheming. They plan it all out on their beds at night. And then when morning comes, they do it. Because why? Because they can. Because it's in their power. What do? They want a field? They just take it. Houses? They take them. They rob a man, his house, a man and his inheritance, meaning his family, those who are weak and powerless, taking what he's supposed to have to be perpetually owned is taking away from him. In verses 3 through 5, another sentence is pronounced. Behold, or every time you see the word behold, it's like, look here, pay attention. God says, I am planning against this family. What family? Back up to verse 1, those who scheme iniquity. I'm planning against them a calamity from which you cannot, speaking to them, you cannot remove your necks. You will not walk so haughtily or so proudly anymore, for it will be an evil time. On that day, and we know that the connotation of the phrase on that day, those that you've done this to, will take up against you a taunt or a lament, and the utter bitter lamentation, and they, the ones who are scheming, will say, we are completely destroyed. He exchanges the portion of my people, how he removes it from me. To the apostate, to the enemy, he gives our fields to the enemy. Therefore you have no one stretching a measuring line for you by lot in the assembly of the Lord. In other words, there will be nobody, there's no reason to even survey the land, because there's not going to be anybody there to live there. Verses 6 through 11, I thought was really interesting, and the way I titled it, the words and the acts of the schemers. This is what the schemers do. Do not, this is the implied you, don't you speak out, so they say. Who's the they? These schemers from verse 1. But if they do not speak out, if God's prophets don't speak out concerning these things, it reminded me of that scripture in Romans, how are they going to hear if nobody tells them, if they don't speak out? If they don't speak out, reproaches will not be turned back. It's being said, O house of Jacob, both north and south, is the Spirit of the Lord impatient? Are these his doings? Do not my words do good? The one who hears them is blessed. Don't they do good to the one who is doing good, to the one who is walking uprightly? Is he not blessed? Recently, my people have arisen as an enemy. This is what they do. You strip the robe off of the garment from the unsuspecting passerby. They just take what they want from anybody passing by. debatable whether they're taking it from those returning from war or if they'll look like people returning from war by the time they get through with them. But at any rate, they just take what they want. The poor are being taken advantage of. Let me make sure I've got my notes together. You evict the women. They take, as I said earlier, take her from her house that's filled with memories. From her children, you take my splendor forever. Rise and go, for this is no place of rest. And he goes on in this. Verse 11 is interesting. My New American Standard says, if a man walking after the wind and falsehood. Now, I didn't really understand what that meant. The King James Version says, if a man walking in spirit in falsehood had told lies. In other words, these are false prophets. I wrote down the man walking after the wind was a blowhard. That's just what it sounded like to me. But if a false prophet had told lies and said, I will speak to you concerning wine and liquor, that would be fine. They'd love to hear that. You talk to me about that all day long. And then verses 12 and 13, as we so often use, but God. God is speaking in verses 12 and 13. But I will assemble all of you, Jacob. I will gather the remnant of Israel, the north, what's left. I will put them together like sheep in the fold, like a flock in the midst of the pasture. They will be noisy with me. There'll be all kinds of people there. The breaker goes up before them. And somebody else's translation, verse 13. What's verse 13 say?
Breaker, and then it says Messiah.
Messiah. What else? Anybody else?
Mine says the one who breaks open the way.
Yeah, that's really better. Just the breaker, and now Sandy's expands on that, and it makes sense. But the breaker who opens the way makes more sense. The breaker goes before them. This is the one who breaks open the way. They break out, pass through the gate, and go out by it. And then this is how we know it's the Messiah. So their king goes before them. This is the parallelism there that he repeats. They go out through the gate, meaning they're leaving captivity. The king goes before them as they leave captivity. And every time I hear that together, I think of Ephesians 4. He took captivity captive, and the Lord at their head. That's the hope in this first message, in this first judgment. The indictment is laid out. The sentence is given. The judgment is given. What's going to happen? What's being done to the people? But God. But God will save the remnant. The king will go out before them. So that's the first message. The second message in chapters 3 through 5 is the coming ruler. In verses 1 through 4, we find Micah rebuking the leaders. It begins, verse 1, and I said, hear now. That's how we know that's a new message. Hear now, heads of Jacob and rulers of the house of Israel. Is it not for you to know justice? Do you not know? You who hate good and love evil, and all these things that they say they do. And here is the rebuke of the ones who should be caring for the people. Well, we could go down some rabbit trails on that if we weren't on camera. So. But the leaders should be taking care of the people. But then in verse 4, and the leaders, cry out to the Lord, but he won't answer them. Instead, he will hide his face from them. Why? Because they have practiced evil deeds. Verses 5 through 8 is the rebuke. One of the commentaries called it something about false prophets. But the more I read it, it reminded me, we've talked about Balaam before. Remember, we talked about Balaam. We called him, he was a prophet for profit. If he was alive today, he'd be a televangelist. That's who we're talking about now in verses 5 through 8. Rebuke of the prophets for profit. These prophets who lead my people astray when they have something to bite on with their teeth. I mean, if you're giving them food, if you're giving them money, if you're giving them stuff, they're all for peace then. But if you don't give them any money, then they declare holy war against you. So he says, for them it will be night for you, false prophets. You're not going to have vision anymore. You're not going to have divination. The sun will go down on the false prophets, and the day will be dark. The seers will be ashamed. The diviners will be embarrassed. They will cover their mouths. They have nothing to say anymore because there is no answer from God. Even Balaam, as a false prophet, spoke with God. He tried his best to curse the Israelites, and just good stuff come out of his mouth. It's just amazing. And even these false prophets, remember, what is it, Matthew, I think it's Matthew 7. It says, did we not prophesy in your name? Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? Go away from me, I never knew you. That doesn't mean they don't talk with God. They do. But this is what's going to happen to them. And then verses 9 through 11 is the rebuke of everybody. In case I left out anybody, he said, this is everybody else. Now hear this, an addendum to the message. Hear this, heads of the house of Jacob, rulers of the house of Israel. Verse 11, verse 10, those who build Jerusalem, those who do all these things, they hate justice, they twist everything, they build Zion with bloodshed, Jerusalem with violent injustice. Her leaders pronounce judgment for a bribe. Do we not see that? Her priests are priests for a price. If you depend on what do you give me? Her prophets divine for money, yet they lean on the Lord. So, we're the Lord's people. He's going to take care of us. Calamity won't come on us. We're the Lord's people. And then verse 12 is the result of their actions. Therefore, because of all that he said, therefore, on account of you, it's all your fault. Because of you, because of what you've done, Zion will be plowed like a field. Jerusalem will become a heap of ruins. The mountain of the temple will become a high place of the forest. This is going to happen in Jerusalem, in the southern kingdom, because of what you've done. And it did happen in AD, in the 130s somewhere, AD. Zion was plowed like a field. The rest of this second message in chapter 4, verses 1 through 8, in verses 1 through 8, we have a picture of the millennium in comparison against verses 9 through chapter 5, 1, against the chaos of the day. The millennium versus the chaos. And we said that verse 4, 1 through, let's see, what is it? 3 is quoted exactly in Isaiah chapter 2. It will come about in the last days, the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as chief among the mountains. Raised up. And we will see that. We actually read about that in the book of Revelation. These things will happen. What the New Jerusalem and the millennial reign will be like. They'll hammer their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks, never take up war again. We've seen that before. But the comparison, on into verse through verse 8. Verse 4, they'll sit under their own tree. They'll have freedom to come and go as they want to do. Everything will be back in the way that it was. And in verse 6, in that day, then declares the Lord, I will assemble the lame and gather the outcasts. Everybody will be taken care of in that day, all the way through verse 8. And I need to hurry here a little bit, but verse 8, I want to share just a little bit on verse 8. I don't know if any of your commentaries said much about, or in your study Bible said much about verse 8. Amy, did you pick up anything on verse 8? The tower of the flock. I only saw that in one commentary, but a few years ago, I was listening to a sermon by Dean Hahn, who is the pastor at First Baptist Church in Morristown. And he was preaching on this. it's kind of interesting because he has this same East Tennessee Southern drawl that we do. The tower of the flock in Hebrew is Migdal Eder. Migdal meaning tower, Eder meaning the flock. Migdal Eder. I was taking notes and I thought he said Migdal Eder, like Irish Migdali Eder. What in the world is Migdal Eder? I wrote it. Finally found out it was Migdal Eder, the tower of the flock, hill of the daughter of Zion. There are some scholars who believe that that's speaking of a specific place where the lambs were birthed and would also have been the place where Jesus would have actually been born. That was the stable. That was the place where he was born. I don't really have time to develop that and go into that, but I just thought that was so interesting. But a lot of the commentaries don't mention that. It talks about this, it's referring to Israel as we know it today, being the tower of the flock, being the one who to whom the former dominion will come. But then verses 9 through chapter 5, verse 1, that is compared against or laid against the chaos of the day that they're living in. They're back in their day. Why do you cry out loudly? Is there no king among you? Has your counselor perished? All these things that they're going on. Verse 10 on down, it says, you'll be like a woman in childbirth, for now you will go out of the city. Now remember, now he's only talking about the southern kingdom. Now you will go out of the city, you will dwell in the field and go to Babylon. But then he jumps ahead 70 years, and from there you will be rescued. From there the Lord will redeem you from the hand of your enemies.
What verse are you on?
That was verse 10 of chapter 4. Make sure I keep it in my place here. But all these things, and the rest of that are the things that they are dealing with at the current time. The Lord will redeem you from the hand of the enemy, but you will have to go there. Yeah, I mean, you know, some of you know my pet peeve with Jeremiah 29:11. And everybody talks about, for I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord, plans for good and not for evil. And people just, they hold on to that for the new year and all these. You got to know the context. Jeremiah is saying that, the Lord is saying that to them as they are on their way into exile. He will take care of them in exile, but they're going to be there for 70 years. And here he will redeem them, but you have to go there first. Verse 11, now many nations have assembled against you. And we see that all of this happening, they'll be gloated over. Remember we saw that in Obadiah? Remember how Edom gloated over them when they went into captivity? On down through verse 13 and then chapter 5 verse 1. Now muster yourselves in troops, daughter of troops. They have laid siege against us. And that is the time frame that he's talking about. But then the second part of verse 1 of chapter 5 gives us the hope again. There's still that, no matter what they've done wrong, no matter how they're punished, no matter what the indictment is, no matter what the sentence is, there's the hope. With a rod they will smite the judge of Israel on the cheek, but as for you, Bethlehem Ephratah, how you pronounce that, too little to be among the clans of Judah. The one from you, one will go forth for me to be a ruler in Israel. His goings forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity. He is forever. He will give up, God will give them, Judah, up until the time when she who is in labor has borne a child. We see that Revelation 12, that picture. Then the remainder of his brethren will return to the sons of Israel. He will arise and be a shepherd. We see all these pictures of him. He'll be a shepherd in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord is God. They will remain in safety. He will be great to the ends of the earth. He will be our peace when the Assyrian invades our land. Now this is speaking of the future, but the major enemy that Israel knew, Judah and Israel knew at that time, was Assyria. If if you wanted to name, and we're not going to do it because we're on camera, but if you wanted to name the worst enemy the world has, you could pick one. If you're talking about an enemy we're going to have, 100 years from now, should the Lord tarry, you might give it this name or you might give it that name because that's the worst enemy you know right now. So that's what they're using. They're using the name Assyria, but we know he speaks of the enemies because in verse 6 he says the land of Nimrod, and that is both Assyria and Babylon. And he will deliver us from the Assyrian when the Assyrian attacks our land. And then the remnant of Jacob. Chapter 5, verse 1 through verse 15 speaks of the one who is coming, and I'm not going to go into reading all of that. All that describes him and all the way down through verse 15. So quickly, the third message is the coming kingdom in chapters 6 and 7. And he begins again. Now, the way my translation reads, it's not just here, it's here now. Here now before it's too late. Arise, plead your case before the mountains, and let the hills hear your voice. Listen, you mountains, to the indictment of the Lord. So first of all, in verses 1 and 2, we have the indictment because of what they've done. The Lord has a case against his people. Verses 3 through 5 is God's faithfulness. The defense, and as we talked about this earlier, you can just feel God's heart crying out, what have I done to you? What have I done to make you hate me? What have I done that I've wearied you? I brought you up from Egypt. I brought you out of slavery. I did this and this and this. All these things that he had done in order that, into verse 5, that you might know the righteous acts of the Lord. Verses 6 and 7 is the people's response. It could be our response. So what am I supposed to do? What shall I come to the Lord? Shall I bring him more tithes and offerings? Should I bring more? Should I be on more committees? Should I do more work? What more can I do? Because religion in that day had just become a ritual. And then, as we said, verse 8, now we understand verse 8. This is what he wants. This is what he wants. He's told you, oh man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, love kindness, and that is the word hesed, loving kindness, and walk humbly with your God. Verses 9 through 16 is the Lord's rebuke against Israel. And then chapter 7 is the reasons why God is Israel's only hope and the reason why he is our only hope. Verses 1 through 6, because there's no one else to depend on. There's no godly person. They're all been perished from the land. In verse 4, the best of them is like a briar. I mean, you just think about how they don't trust a neighbor, even the people in your own household. There is no one to trust but God. Verses 7 through 13, because God is the only light. But as for me, I will watch expectantly for the Lord. And verse 8, though I dwell in darkness, the Lord is a light for me. Verses 14 through 17, because God is my shepherd, I shall not want, we add. Verse 14, and this is Micah's prayer. You can hear him praying this. Please, Lord, shepherd thy people with thy scepter, the flock of thy possession, which dwells by itself in the woodland, in the midst of a fruitful field. Let them feed in Bashan and Gilead, where there's really good food and really good grazing, just like they used to do. Verse 15, God says, I'll do that in the days of old. As in the days of old when you came out of Egypt, I will show you miracles. And Micah goes on, all of these things that nations will see and be ashamed, that they will lick the dust like a serpent. All these things that will happen, they will be afraid before the Lord. And in verses 18 and 20, the reason that God is Israel's only hope, the reason he's our only hope, is because God delights in loving kindness. Who is a God like thee, who pardons iniquity and passes over the rebellious act of the remnant of his possession? who is a God like you that forgives us? I mean, we know how bad we've been, but He forgives us. He does not retain His anger forever. Why? Because He delights. My translation says in unchanging love, but it's the word hesed, loving kindness. God delights in loving kindness. He will have compassion on us. He will tread our iniquities underfoot. He'll throw them all, hurl them, as we said earlier, into the sea. And you will give truth to Jacob, just like you promised to Abraham, just like you swore to our fathers from the days of old. And as I read that last line, I was reminded of John in Revelation 22, verse 20, where he says, even so, come, Lord Jesus. So, I've got a quick little thing for a closing application, but anything you want to share on that? I know that we went through that really fast. I really would have liked to have broken it down, but there's just no time to go over every verse.
As you know, I've been watching Little House on the Prairie.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'm probably the only person in the world that binge watches Little House on the Prairie. But one of the things that Adam, who's a blind man, says that just struck me, and I hear it so much in the scripture, he says, when you're living in the dark, the only light you have is truth.
Right.
And that just...
That's powerful.
Yeah.
That is powerful. Well, Ward Wiersbe said, the better we know the character of God, the more we can trust Him for the future. The better we know the promises and covenants of God, the more peace we will have in our hearts when things fall apart. And I read that last night, and I still am, in the midst of a situation. And I've been trying to work through, and I realized I hadn't prayed about it. Just one of those things, that you're dealing with, And I realized, I'm not prayed about this. So I prayed about it. And as I was praying this morning, as I said earlier, those words from Deuteronomy and Joshua and Hebrews came to me. I will never leave you nor forsake you. And so now I'm just waiting on the answer to that prayer. But what we have to remember about Micah's words, like Isaiah's and like we'll see in Nahum next time, what we have to remember is that the southern kingdom won't go into captivity for almost another 100 years. And then it will be another 70 after that before they return. And another 2,500 plus until Israel's back in the land. That happened 1948. And of course the millennial reign is still future today. So, we touched on this last time a little bit. Did Micah's words affect those people's everyday lives? This is not going to happen for 100 years out. Did it even affect their day-to-day lives? But here's what's interesting at this. I asked this same question, you remember, last time as we were finishing up Isaiah. The Monday night group was the only group that said that upon learning of a future natural destruction, they would begin preparing now. Both other groups said, probably if I thought it was going to be 100 years off, probably wouldn't change a bit how I live. Well, you all said it would change. My question now is, has it changed? Because it is coming. We may not know if it's 50 years or 100 years or 6 weeks. It is coming. Disaster is coming. So I hope you are preparing mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually, because destruction is coming. We just don't know exactly when. So, comments, questions?
Well, I think just the very knowledge that it is coming has changed you.
Yeah, it should. It really should. It really, if nothing else, these bank failures in the last 2 weeks should have, at least made you think a little bit.
Give you pause.
Give you pause, exactly. All right, well, if you...
safe isn't big enough to do. I gotta go to the bank and get all my money.
Yeah. both quarters.
That's right.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, the temptation is to think I've got
You can close that off now, Joe.
I've got to hoard. I've got to get more money. I've got to get more